This bull was screaming in rage, an untamable beast feared by everyone. But a deaf kid walked up and calmed it with silence. What happens next will leave you speechless. The rider hit the dirt hard, his body twisting as the bull's horn missed his chest by inches. The man barely scrambled away before the beast, a dark-coated monster called Thundercry, spun and thundered against the fence with such force that the wooden rails shuddered and splinters snapped into the air. Dust clouded the pen, screams and shouts rippling through the crowd as chaos took hold. Thundercry bellowed again, the sound shaking through the ground like a storm breaking against stone. Guards rushed in with long spears, trying to circle him, their boots sinking into the churned earth, but their shouting and prodding only made the bull more furious. He lowered his head, eyes blazing, muscles trembling with rage, and charged, scattering the men like children. One was thrown against the fence so hard he lay motionless, and the crowd roared in panic. Amid the shouting and the thunder of hooves, a boy's eyes fixed on the raging animal. Jonah, 14 years old, stood just beyond the fence, pressed against the wooden rail. His chest rose and fell, but his expression carried none of the wild fear stamped on the faces around him. Where others saw chaos, Jonah studied. His eyes followed the twitch of Thundercry's shoulders, the tremble of his nostrils, the rhythm of the hooves pounding the earth. He saw the fury, yes, but also something else hidden in the creature's movements, loneliness, a kind of restless despair. Jonah's father, Elias, stood beside him, weathered hands gripping his son's shoulder. "Stay back, Jonah," Elias muttered, his voice tense, his gaze locked on the bull. His shirt clung with sweat, and his jaw tightened as another guard was nearly skewered by the charging beast. He turned to his son, speaking louder now, panic edging his tone. "Do you see what he's doing? He'll kill any man who steps in there." Jonah looked at his father but gave no reply. His lips pressed together, his eyes bright with an intensity Elias had seen only a few times before. The boy had been deaf since birth. Words thrown at him were like stones skipping across water, never sinking. Instead, he watched, always watching, taking in details most men missed. Elias squeezed his shoulder again, but Jonah had already shifted his gaze back to Thundercry. The crowd surged with noise, men shouting for blood, others yelling for safety, bets being called off, warnings screamed at the guards, but Jonah heard none of it. For him, there was only silence, a silence broken only by the sight of dust drifting, the ground trembling beneath his boots, and the bull's wild, searching eyes. Thundercry's hooves struck sparks as he wheeled toward another man, and the crowd gasped. Elias cursed under his breath and pulled Jonah closer to him, shielding the boy instinctively. But in the swirl of chaos, Jonah's mind was racing. He did not flinch at the bull's roar because he never heard it. He saw only the rhythm of its rage, like a pattern playing before him. Where others saw unpredictable madness, Jonah saw a dance of muscle and fury. Then the unthinkable happened. One guard tripped in the dirt, falling directly into the bull's path. Thundercry lowered his head, the sharp curve of his horn glinting in the sun. Elias shouted, "No!" But the man had no time to rise. Thundercry lunged. Jonah's hand tightened on the rail. His breath caught, but his eyes sharpened, as though something inside him had just made a decision. He turned his head, watching the chaos around him. Men scrambling, guards retreating, the pen locked tight to keep the beast from breaking loose. And then he looked down. There, where two fence posts didn't quite meet, was a gap just wide enough for a boy his size. "Jonah!" Elias barked, his voice breaking with alarm as he felt his son shift. He tried to grab him, but Jonah was already moving. Quick as a shadow, he slid through the opening, the wooden edge scraping his sleeve. He dropped into the pen, his boots hitting dirt that still quivered with the bull's pounding hooves. The crowd froze, voices catching in their throats. For a heartbeat, all sound seemed to vanish except for the thunder of the bull. Inside the pen, Jonah stood, dust swirling around him. Thundercry's eyes snapped toward him, nostrils flaring. The beast stomped once, lowering his head, his muscles rippling as though preparing for another charge. The boy's chest rose and fell, but he did not back away. Instead, Jonah took a step forward. Men shouted now, their voices frantic. Elias's face was pale as death as he pounded against the fence. "Open the gate! Get him out of there!" he screamed, his throat raw. But no one moved. The guards were too stunned, the crowd too captivated by the impossible sight of a deaf boy standing alone before the monster that no man had controlled. Jonah's hands hung loosely by his sides, his palms open, his steps steady. He tilted his head, watching the bull not as a man facing death, but as if he were studying a puzzle. His silence became part of the air, an unnatural calm against the storm of the animal's rage. Thundercry snorted, dirt spraying beneath his hooves, his massive chest heaving. For a moment it seemed the beast would crush him where he stood. Jonah's lips moved slightly, though no sound came. His eyes locked with the bull's, not wavering, not pleading, simply holding. It was not defiance, nor fear. It was something else, something the crowd could not name, but would never forget. The dust thickened, the sun beat down, and the boy's shadow stretched across the dirt toward the towering beast. Then Thundercry's muscles tensed again. His tail flicked, his nostrils flared, and the silence shattered as he released a roar that shook the ground. And still, Jonah did not move. No one noticed until it was too late, until the deaf boy stood inside the pen, facing the roaring monster head-on. Gasps tore through the air as Jonah stepped closer, his small figure dwarfed by the towering bulk of Thundercry. The boy's boots pressed into the churned earth, steady despite the tremors of the ground. His father's voice rose above the crowd, raw with desperation. "Jonah, stop! Get out of there!" Elias tried to climb down from the stands, shoving through men who grabbed his arms to restrain him. His face was pale, his hands shaking, and he fought against them with the strength of a father who could only watch his son walk toward death. But Jonah did not stop. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost like he was in a world apart from the panic around him. His eyes never left the bull. Thundercry's body rippled with rage, his massive shoulders shivering as though trying to shake off invisible chains. His nostrils flared, hot steam puffing into the cold morning air, and his hooves carved trenches into the dirt. Every flick of the tail, every shift of muscle, warned of an explosion waiting to happen. The crowd, caught between horror and awe, pressed against the rails, unable to look away. The bull had crushed men twice Jonah's size without hesitation. He had flung riders into the air like rag dolls, broken bones with a twist of his horns, and sent seasoned wranglers fleeing for their lives. And yet this boy, unarmed, barehanded, with nothing but silence surrounding him, kept walking forward. Jonah could not hear the roars that rattled the bones of every man in the stands. He could not hear his father's cries or the gamblers shouting their wagers. What reached him were vibrations, the pounding of hooves trembling through his feet, the shiver of the wooden rails rattling under fists, the quiver of air whenever the bull's bellow shook the ground. And sight. He read the story in every twitch of Thundercry's body, every stomp of a hoof, every tilt of the head. It was like watching a language no one else understood. He stopped moving when he felt the rhythm change. The bull's stomp slowed, his chest heaving with the force of his breath. The air itself felt charged, like the pause before lightning splits the sky. Then, with terrifying speed, Thundercry lunged. His horns cut the air, his body surging forward with the weight of a storm. The crowd screamed. Elias thrashed against the men holding him back, his voice tearing from his throat. "Jonah!" But the boy did not run. He did not stumble or cry out. His hand lifted slowly, almost gently, rising like a signal in the dust-filled air. His palm was open, steady, facing the charging bull. To the astonishment of all, Thundercry slowed. His massive head tilted as if confused, the sharp arc of his horns passing inches from Jonah's chest. Dirt sprayed, and the ground shook as the bull stamped to a halt. Silence fell over the arena, so sudden and absolute it pressed on the ears of every man present. Men who had mocked Jonah only minutes before now leaned forward, their mouths open, uncertain if they were witnessing a miracle or the cruel setup to a tragedy about to unfold. Jonah stood still, rooted in calmness. His eyes locked onto the bull's, not breaking, not flinching. He was still as stone, his breath steady, his body unshaken. And in that stillness, Thundercry's rage wavered. The animal's chest rose and fell, his sides heaving with strain, but the fire in his eyes softened. For a fleeting heartbeat, he seemed less a monster and more a creature desperate to be understood. The crowd did not know what they were seeing, but Jonah did. He felt the rhythm shift again, not of violence, but of recognition. His silence had reached the beast in a way noise and force never could. The bull pawed at the ground, but the fury in his stance eased, his body leaning closer to stillness than to slaughter. Jonah's lips pressed together, his gaze unwavering, his hand still raised. But just as the fragile moment seemed to hold, a voice cut through the arena, sharp and venomous. "What are you fools doing? Don't just stand there! Drive it back into rage!" The words belonged to Magnus Crowell, the arena's owner, his broad shoulders and fine coat marking him as a man of wealth and power. His face twisted with fury as he leaned over the rail, his dark eyes locked on the boy. Magnus was no man to let a child steal the spectacle he had promised his paying crowd. To him, Jonah's quiet miracle was no blessing. It was theft, a disruption to the show that made him rich and feared. He jabbed a finger toward the guards stationed at the edge of the ring. "Rattle your spears. Don't let the beast calm down. The crowd didn't pay for a child's trick. They came for blood." His voice carried with cruel command, his tone dripping with contempt. The guards hesitated, uncertain. They had seen the impossible. Thundercry slowing for a boy. Their eyes darted between Magnus's furious glare and the sight in the pen. But Magnus's wealth and influence weighed heavily, and obedience came easier than defiance. With grim expressions, they raised their spears and clashed them against the rails, the sharp clang splitting through the tense silence. The sudden noise shattered the fragile peace. Thundercry flinched, his head jerking back, muscles seizing with rage as the harsh sound drove into him. He bellowed, his roar so loud it rattled the boards. The calm in his eyes vanished, replaced by fire. The bull lunged again, this time faster, closer, his horns slicing through the air. Jonah reacted instantly. His body swayed to the side, his boots sliding over the dirt in a movement so precise it seemed rehearsed. The tip of Thundercry's horn passed so near it brushed Jonah's sleeve, tearing a thread, but the boy remained standing. The crowd roared in shock, some clutching their heads, others shouting warnings. Elias fell against the rail, clutching it with white knuckles, his chest heaving as though he had run miles. His voice cracked with desperation. "Please, somebody stop this! He's just a boy!" But Jonah knew it was not luck that had saved him. He had seen the signs, the slight shift in Thundercry's weight before the lunge, the fraction of a second when the bull's gaze narrowed, the trembling rhythm of the ground. It was music, silent music only he could feel, and his body had moved in time with it. Still, the danger was greater now than before. Magnus was not done. He shouted again, his face red with fury. "Keep him wild! Do not let that boy steal my beast from me!" His words cut through the air, venom in every syllable. Jonah stood, his chest rising and falling, sweat tracing down his face. He tightened his hands into fists and then loosened them again, forcing calm back into his body. His silence was his strength, but Magnus's schemes and the bull's rage were forces that pressed against him like storm winds. The boy understood in his own way that what he faced now was more than just a beast. It was a test, one that would push him beyond anything he had ever known. And still, he did not retreat. Only Jonah's sudden step to the side, perfectly timed with the beast's movement, saved him. It was not luck. Jonah had studied the bull's rhythm like music only he could feel. Still, with Magnus scheming and the bull raging, Jonah's calm would soon be tested beyond anything he had ever faced. The arena descended into chaos as Magnus slammed his hand against the rail and bellowed for his men to escalate. His voice was sharp, venom cutting through the air like a whip. "Do not let that animal bow to him. Drive it wild again. The people came for blood, not silence." His face flushed crimson, his jaw clenched, and his eyes burned with fury. The crowd, confused by the shift in command, erupted in a storm of shouts, some demanding Jonah be spared, others hungry for the carnage Magnus promised. The air was heavy with dust and dread, every heartbeat echoing like a drum against the walls of the pen. But Jonah was not the fragile victim Magnus imagined him to be. Standing in the center of the storm, the boy crouched low, his gaze sharp and unwavering. He was not reacting to the roar of the crowd or the cruel commands of Magnus. His world had shrunk to Thundercry, the ripple of muscles across the bull's massive flanks, the twitch of a tail slicing the air, the faint tremor in the ground with each step. Jonah's silence sharpened his focus, and in that silence, patterns unfolded before him like a song without sound. Thundercry's next charge came swift and violent, his horns glinting under the sun as he thundered forward. Dust rose around his hooves, his weight tearing into the earth. Any other man would have run, but Jonah did not. He lowered his body, his palm rising at the perfect moment, and as the horn passed, he placed his hand against it, not to stop, not to resist, but to redirect. His body flowed with the bull's force, turning with it like water guiding a current. The boy and the beast spun together, moving as one, and neither struck the other. A collective gasp tore from the stands. Men clutched their hats, gamblers dropped their wagers, and hardened ranchers who had seen death before could not comprehend the sight. Elias's voice rose again, hoarse and desperate. "Open the gate! Let him out! He's just a boy!" His hands pounded against the rail until his knuckles bled, his body trembling with helpless rage. But Magnus's sneer cut across his pleas. The Baron leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with cruelty. "No one opens that gate," he snarled at his guards. "Not until I say. They will watch, and they will remember. This spectacle is mine." His words dripped with greed, his tone as heavy as iron shackles. Inside the pen, Jonah moved with the bull again, crouching low, sliding across the dirt, his eyes locked to every twitch and tremor of the beast. He was not fighting for applause or survival alone. Something deeper bound him to the animal before him, an unspoken understanding that silence bridged. Slowly, impossibly, his presence chipped away at Thundercry's rage. The moment of change came like dawn breaking through storm clouds. Jonah stepped forward, calm and deliberate, until he was close enough to feel the warmth of the bull's breath wash over his face. The crowd froze, breathless, as he lifted his forehead and pressed it gently against Thundercry's massive snout. For a heartbeat, The world itself seemed to stop. Thundercry's chest heaved, his nostrils flaring wide, and then he stilled. The bull lowered his head, not in defeat, but in submission. Gasps erupted, followed by a silence so heavy it crushed the air. Men who had wagered fortunes on bloodshed could not believe their eyes. The most feared beast in Crowell's arena bowed before a deaf boy with no weapon, no shield, only silence. Even hardened wranglers who had mocked Jonah earlier now gripped the rails with reverence, as though they were witnessing something sacred. Elias's knees buckled, his face wet with tears, his hands clutching the wooden rail as though it were the only thing keeping him from falling. "Jonah," he whispered, his voice breaking into a sound between disbelief and prayer. But Magnus Crowell's fury boiled over. His face twisted into a mask of rage, and he slammed his fist against the post so hard the wood splintered. "No!" he roared. "This is not the ending! I will not have my arena mocked by a child and a beast!" His pride was wounded deeper than any wound could cut. To him, Jonah's miracle was not triumph. It was humiliation. He spun to his men, his voice cracking like thunder. "Release the second bull, now!" The guards froze, their eyes wide. "But sir—" One dared to speak, only to be silenced by Magnus's glare. "Do it!" Magnus shouted, his face contorted with madness. "I want blood in that dirt before the day is done!" Reluctantly, the men obeyed. The iron gate groaned as it was drawn back, the chains rattling like the sound of doom. The crowd, once silent in awe, erupted into chaos, some shouting in protest, others roaring with excitement at the promise of renewed violence. Dust swirled as the doors swung open, and from the darkness of the chute, another bull stormed out. This one was smaller than Thundercry, but no less deadly. Its body was compact, muscles coiled tight with aggression, its horns shorter but sharper, its eyes filled with fury. It charged into the arena with a shriek of rage, lowering its head as it thundered forward. But its target was not Jonah. The second bull barreled straight at Thundercry. The deaf boy found himself trapped between giants as the earth shook with the clash of beasts. Thundercry bellowed, his body swinging to meet the newcomer's charge, horns crashing against horns with a sound like clashing steel. Dust exploded into the air, cloaking the arena in a storm of chaos. Jonah stumbled back, his eyes wide, the vibration of the duel rippling through his body like an earthquake. The crowd's voices rose into a deafening roar. Men cheered, others cursed, gamblers shouted frantically as fortunes shifted with every clash of horn and hoof. Elias screamed Jonah's name until his throat was raw, his arms straining against the men who held him back from leaping into the pit. Jonah spun, searching desperately for a path out, but every direction was blocked by the swirling battle of the two bulls. Their bodies slammed together, horns locking, muscles straining as each tried to overpower the other. Dirt sprayed, hooves thundered, and the deaf boy stood in the storm's eye, his heart pounding in his chest. And then the twist revealed itself. Thundercry did not turn his fury against Jonah. He turned it against the second bull. With every strike, every roar, Thundercry shielded the boy, placing his massive body between Jonah and the sharp horns of the intruder. The bond forged in silence had transformed into something greater: loyalty. Thundercry fought not just for himself, but for the boy who had calmed him. The second bull lunged again, horns slicing through the dust, but Thundercry met it head-on, his weight driving the smaller beast back. The sound of the collision shook the stands, sending a shockwave through the crowd. Jonah pressed himself low to the ground, eyes wide, every nerve alive with fear and awe. He could feel the battle in his bones, every tremor of earth a reminder of the fragile line between survival and death. The arena shook with cheers, chants rising for the boy and the beast together. Men who once mocked Jonah now roared his name, their voices carrying like thunder. The miracle of silence had become a spectacle of loyalty and defiance, and the crowd was no longer on Magnus's side. Magnus stood stiff, his fists clenched so tight the veins bulged against his skin. His face twisted with humiliation as he realized the truth. He had lost control. No amount of greed, no command to his guards, could erase the miracle unfolding before him. Jonah's quiet triumph had destroyed his power. The crowd's cheers shook the ground, but Magnus, humiliated, clenched his fists. He had lost control, and he knew the boy's quiet triumph had just destroyed his power. In the days that followed, Stoneford could not stop speaking of the miracle they had witnessed. Men who had once spit Jonah's name in pity or disdain now spoke it in awe. At the tavern, ranchers who normally boasted of their own strength lowered their voices to retell the moment the boy pressed his forehead against Thundercry and lived. At the marketplace, farmers leaned over their wagons, trading not grain or tools, but stories of how silence had bent fury into peace. Even in the quiet streets at dusk, when lamps glowed soft and cattle lowed from distant fields, Jonah's name drifted through the air as if it belonged to legend already. Elias kept a watchful eye over both boy and bull. Thundercry now lived under his care, though lived seemed too small a word for what had taken root. The beast that once shook the ground with terror now stood calmly when Jonah approached, his vast head lowering in recognition, his breath slow and steady. Elias often found Jonah sitting against the fence posts, watching Thundercry graze as though listening to an invisible conversation. The sight stirred something in him. Pride, yes, but also fear, for he knew that miracles drew both reverence and envy. One morning, a group of cattlemen approached Elias's ranch. Their boots kicked up dust, their hats pulled low against the sun. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Harlan, leaned against the fence and called out, "Elias, is it true? Will the bull let the boy touch him still?" Jonah, standing nearby, turned to the bull and stretched out his hand. Thundercry raised his head, snorted once, and then, as if answering an ancient signal, walked slowly toward the boy. Dust clung to the beast's hide, scars laced across his shoulders, but his steps were steady. Jonah pressed his palm against Thundercry's brow, and the animal stilled, his massive body folding into calmness. The men at the fence removed their hats, their mouths open as if in prayer. "I've seen cattle trained," Harlan whispered, his voice barely holding steady, "but I've never seen one choose a man." Elias folded his arms, his eyes sweeping the group. "Then remember what you've seen. It ain't training, it's trust." The men left speaking Jonah's name with respect, carrying the story to every corner of Stoneford. Yet while admiration grew, so too did resentment. Magnus Crowell had lost more than wagers that day. He had lost the town's faith. His control, once as firm as iron, now cracked with every retelling of Jonah's triumph. At the saloon, whispers turned to laughter when his name was spoken. At the bank, men hesitated before signing contracts tied to his land. Even his own ranch hands avoided his eyes, for they too had seen the truth with their own eyes in the arena. Magnus stewed in silence, but silence to him was poison. In the dim halls of his manor, he paced like a caged wolf, the fire in the hearth snapping as though mocking his unrest. He poured whiskey that burned his throat, but it did not dull the bitterness. "A boy," he muttered to himself, his voice trembling between rage and disbelief. "A deaf boy has undone me." His fists slammed against the table, glasses shattering, liquid spilling like blood across the wood. His advisors urged him to forget it, to let the matter fade. But Magnus could not. To him, Jonah's miracle was not a tale of hope. It was a wound to his pride, an infection that spread with every telling. He schemed to discredit the boy. He whispered in markets that the bull had been drugged. He bribed a ranch hand to claim Elias staged the event. Yet each lie withered under the weight of truth. Too many had witnessed it. Too many knew what they saw, and so the bitterness inside him grew like a disease. The breaking point came weeks later when Magnus gathered his men under cover of night. Their torches flickered as they rode hard toward Elias's ranch, chains clinking from their saddlebags. "If I cannot own the boy," Magnus spat, his eyes glinting with malice, "I will own the beast, and when the beast is mine, the town will bow again." His men followed reluctantly, their loyalty bound by pay rather than faith. Elias was at the barn when the riders thundered in. He saw the glow of their torches, the glint of steel, and his heart dropped. "Magnus!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the fields. Jonah, awakened by the noise, ran barefoot into the yard, his eyes wide with confusion. Magnus dismounted, his boots striking the ground with arrogance. "Stand aside, Elias," he demanded, his voice sharp as a blade. "That bull is mine now. The town will forget your boy soon enough." Elias stepped forward, shoulders squared. "Thundercry don't belong to you, Magnus. He never did." Magnus waved his hand, and his men surged forward, ropes and chains in their grasp. They circled Thundercry, throwing lines across his horns, his shoulders, his legs. The beast bellowed, thrashing, the earth shaking with each strike of his hooves. Chains clattered, men shouted, torches swung wildly in the night air. Jonah stood frozen, his chest heaving, until his eyes locked with Thundercry's. In that silent exchange, something unspoken passed between them. The bull, wild and cornered, suddenly surged with a power greater than his bonds. With a violent twist, he snapped one rope, then another, sending men sprawling into the dirt. His horns sliced through the air, scattering chains like straw. Magnus screamed orders, his face pale with desperation. "Hold him! Don't let go!" But his men, terror in their eyes, stumbled back. Thundercry's roar split the night, his hooves striking sparks from stone. One final lunge, and the last of the ropes tore free. Men fled, dropping torches that fizzled in the dirt. And then came the moment no one in Stoneford would ever forget. Thundercry turned, his sides heaving, and walked calmly back to Jonah. Dust clung to his hide, the moonlight glinting across his horns, but his steps were steady, deliberate. He lowered his head and stood protectively before the boy, a living wall of muscle and fury transformed into silent loyalty. Magnus stumbled back, his mouth open, his pride bleeding into fear. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "It cannot be." But it was. Elias, his chest swelling with pride, raised his voice so all could hear. "Look, men! Look and remember! Not one of you could chain that beast, but the boy holds him without a word." The image spread across Stoneford like wildfire. Word traveled faster than any rider. How Magnus had stormed the ranch with chains, only to be shamed by the sight of a bull choosing a deaf boy over power and wealth. Farmers repeated it in the fields, merchants in the square, travelers at the crossroads. By week's end, Magnus could no longer walk through town without hearing whispers, without seeing the smirks of men who once feared him. Shame became heavier than anger, and one morning, Magnus fled. He left behind his manor, his lands, even the cattle that once marked his pride. His name, once bound to wealth and authority, was now chained to cowardice. For Jonah, the experience became more than survival. Sitting in the fields beside Thundercry, feeling the beast's warm breath on his skin, he understood something he never had before. Silence was not weakness. It was strength, sharper than words, stronger than rage. His difference, once the mark of pity, had become the foundation of a legend. He did not become rich, nor did he seek power. Yet his bond with Thundercry rewrote the town's idea of what made a man strong. No longer did Stoneford measure strength in muscle or wealth. It measured it in the boy who faced fury with silence and walked away with loyalty. And in the end, what began as a boy walking into certain death became a legend. The day a deaf child calmed a monster not with words, but with silence. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores powerful themes of empathy, unexpected connections, and the profound bonds that can form between those who are often overlooked by society. This narrative aims to highlight that true understanding transcends language and that compassion can be found in the most unlikely of places.